My name's Clive Marsh. I'm a lecturer at the University of Leicester and a local preacher in the Leicester Trinity Circuit of the Methodist Church. I would long for much more courageous use of poetry, visual arts, music of all kinds, which may not be explicitly religious in its content, but may nevertheless be able to contribute to how people respond. It's really interesting that towards the end of chapter 2, having been very complimentary about the Colossians, Paul implies a bit of criticism of them, perhaps because of what he's heard along the Christian grapevine. He says, "Why do you live as if you still belonged to the world?" That's verse 20. He's concerned about them, and perhaps that's why he'd urge them not to be led astray, and was concerned about the dangers of following every philosophy or empty deceit. But it's interesting too that belonging to the world doesn't mean being wholly uninfluenced by it. Belonging to the world would mean living according to rules and regulations. In other words, being constrained and not living according to Christ. Living in Christ, then, means living within the freedom of Christ. Now, we know from lots of other stuff, Paul says, that living within the freedom of Christ doesn't mean just doing whatever you want, regardless of whatever that is. How could it? But it does mean not being held back by human restrictions. As we see now very radically in the next chapter, chapter 3, the chapter we're looking at this week, living in Christ means there, quote, is no longer Greek and Jew, circumcised and uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave and free, but Christ is all and in all. That's verse 11 of chapter 3. This verse may bring to mind other similar lists in other letters of Paul in Romans, Galatians and 1 Corinthians. Paul has this strategy, in other words, of reminding those he's writing to what freedom in Christ actually amounts to. It's a very, very challenging thing. It cuts through social and political conventions of all kinds and asks people to think very differently about how people are to relate to each other in society. Or at least it does in theory. Because we've got at least two questions that arise from this chapter. Does Paul mean that relationships in Christ only exist in church life, and he knows then full well they can't possibly extend beyond church to wider society? And does that then mean that whatever happens in church, relationships which are in Christ are more inward than outward, and won't actually make much of a social and political difference at all? Given those two questions, I'm inviting us this week to have a close look at what's being said about slavery, as just one of the examples of what it means to be in Christ. There's no longer slave and free, says Paul. That's the background belief for his words to slaves and slave owners as to how they conduct themselves, which he does here from chapter 3, verse 22 through to the first verse of chapter 4. Read those verses slowly and carefully together. What do these words of Paul mean in practice? And then have a watch of the film 12 Years a Slave, the Turner Prize-winning black director Steve McQueen's film version of the memoir of Solomon Northup, who in the mid-19th century in the US was tricked into slavery for 12 years. It's a harrowing, challenging film. Now, the tricky thing is that it may be right to say that slavery in the modern period, as witnessed in the shocking transatlantic slavery period, is not quite the same as what went on in the first century. So what Paul's talking about here is as much about good employer-employee relationships as anything. Well, that may be so. But we are still talking about power in relationships between human beings and who holds it. And when we're talking about slavery, we're talking about ownership, not just being someone's boss. So we do have to bear that in mind. But even if it's easier to read Colossians 3 in terms of employer-employee relationships, so that it comes alive for you, let's not forget that slavery is actually being talked about. And the basic question remains the same. What difference does being in Christ and the new relationships which come with that, what difference does it actually make to everyday life beyond the church in the world of work and employment relations? One final thought and question as you engage with these issues. One commentator on the letter to the Colossians I read in commenting on verse 11 of chapter 3 says this: where cultural differences exist, the gospel ignores them. Somehow that sounds right in the sense that the gospel is to break down all barriers between people, but ignores them? Is that right? What do you think? No. And by that I mean the gospel, the only way of defending the notion of ignores them, the gospel does not allow the differences to become essential reasons for people being forced apart and treated unequally. But the gospel does not ignore them insofar as the differences will be linked appropriately with people's different identities. So I would say we have now come to say it should not be possible to make that statement anymore in commenting on this and in similar passages. The gospel allows people to be different. And in their difference, it's not their differences which should lead to any kind of inequality. So the gospel doesn't ignore them. The gospel includes people in their difference, and the gospel ensures that in no way should there be inequality or any kind of barriers set up between people who are different from each other on any grounds whatsoever. So that's where we need to nuance, as the jargon would have it, very carefully what's being said by Paul. But yeah, if you ask me about Paul, I don't think Paul has worked through, and he probably couldn't within his own context. I don't think he's worked through the socio-political significance of what he said here, because people slaves would remain slaves. He's just asking slave owners to look after their slaves well. And the chances are that the Christian slave owners, looked after their slaves pretty well, but they still had slaves, and it was still a slave owner, slave mentality. We must not lose sight of that.